Okay, let's go. Sorry.
Okay, good, thank you. Without further ado, I shall start. As Jerome said, I'm basically the worst kind of paleontologist. A career geologist, paleontologist, working on the most obscure of fossils. I found myself by accident caught up, in this developing story of the Anthropocene, which is very many-sided, as you'll hear from Bron. But here I will revert to type, and I will look at the Anthropocene, if you like, from the perspective of Earth history, with a little accent on this idea of habitability. And my first thought here is that habitability is extraordinarily rare, and the more that we look, the rarer it becomes as a cosmic phenomenon. So this is an image of the beginning of the Earth about 4.54 billion years ago, when our pre-planet crashed with a planet which has been given the name Theia, to produce the Earth we now know. And that gave rise to a thoroughly normal planet, so one which was essentially with molten silicates at the surface, probably a silicate atmosphere too, the very young moon you can see very close to the Earth, many meteorite impacts from an early solar system, and astronomers are now finding quite a few examples like this and other varieties of planet, but none yet has been found that we would call definitely habitable and certainly not inhabited. And Earth became an abnormal planet very early on. Again, this is something that is hard to understand. Not less than a billion years, after the beginning of this rather violent, initially very hot planet, which clearly cooled down, and then life arose. Quite when it arose is hard to say, but this is one possible example. These are some graphite crystals within some very old, very deformed rocks, which have a particular structure, which only suggest that life might have started not long after 4 billion years ago. And certainly by 3.5 billion years ago, it's definite, it's for sure, that you have microbial structures on what's now a very abnormal planet of the Earth. And the even more abnormal thing is that this has stayed a living planet throughout everything, a habitable planet for 3.5 billion years continuously, with the same kind of life, marked by the same kind of DNA which arose early. This used to be thought very normal. In the days of Lecomte de Buffon and others, the Earth was thought to be one planet like many others. Well, now we know it's a very strange, exceptional, abnormal planet by comparison with anything in the solar system and anything of the many, now thousands of exoplanets which are now known elsewhere, in the universe. Now that life had its ups and downs, and as we know, it changed, it evolved. One idea it's nice to bear in mind here is the amount of life, something very hard to measure even today. But one can get an idea in relative terms. So let's say about 2.5 billion years ago, one of the key transitions of life in this planet was the development of photosynthesis to produce free oxygen, a very reactive, then a very toxic gas. And the effect of that, over the millions of years to follow, was to kill off most of life and reduce it to, it's thought, something like 10%. of its former content. And then over the tens, hundreds of millions of years that followed, life adapted to this new and toxic and energetic gas, and oxygen respiring forms appeared, evolved, and took over, and so on. But nonetheless, life for a long, long time stayed microbial. And the other thing, which is also hard, I think, for us to grasp, is how stable that life could be. We live in times of change, and we like drama, so we look back to geological past and look for these moments of drama, moments of change. But back then, between about 2 and 1 billion years ago, the chemistry, the paleontology shows us that the Earth was remarkably stable, without any ups and downs of climate or any great evolutionary bursts. So that again is part of the perspective of habitability. I think it's worth bearing in mind. Another one, this is, after what was called the boring billion of not very much happening, life got extremely exciting very quickly, with the most extreme glaciation to affect the Earth, something called snowball Earth, when it's thought that pretty much the whole of the Earth was covered with a carapace of ice, both land and sea. There are arguments about quite how much, but nonetheless, the Earth then would have looked a little bit like, let's say, the moon Europa in the outer solar system looks to us now. And again, it would be hard to say from the outside that this was a habitable planet. Rather like Europa currently, we don't know whether there is life under the ice, clinging on. So an external observer then would not have known that the Earth was then habitable. After the ice, though, again, rather remarkably, instead of life being set back, for a few more billion years, whatever happened may have led to the next phase of life, which was multicellular life, rather strange forms of life at first, and then very quickly, more familiar ones, to give a seafloor which, while not quite like the modern seafloor, it would have at least looked vaguely familiar with mollusks, corals, and such like, and crustaceans and different arthropods of different kinds, hunting or being hunted. So rather late on in life, there is a new kind of habitability, a much more active, energetic, rapidly moving, rapidly evolving one, less stable in that. And probably to, if you like, to set the scene upon the modern world, we go from a situation where there's been a 3 billion year living planet, but largely a 3 billion year life in the seas planet. The land had proved terribly difficult to colonize. So for most of the time, there was little or no life on land until about 400 million years ago, just less than 500 million years ago, that life took to the land and rather quickly colonized it to the effect of forming most of life on land. So in terms of the biomass of life today, most of that is on land, and most of that is forest, which of course creates a new kind of habitability. It creates new niches, new space for both plants and animals to live. So this last piece, if you like, of grosso modo, the planet we know, arrived, if you like, in late Middle Age of the Earth. And of course, there were other crises. There were crises before and after the famous one of the meteorite impact from which collapsed an ecosystem, killed off the dinosaurs, and brought in the modern world of mammals and flowering plants we now know. And again, there were various ups and downs, climate changes, including one, again, a surprising one. About 30 billion years ago, an ice age started, not as extreme as Noble Earth, but nonetheless one that 2.5 billion years ago became a bipolar. Lots of ice, both north and south, and a proper ice age. One would have thought a habitability crisis, and yet it was not so. Over the past 3 million years, that red line on the graph shows 3 million years of worth of climatic ups and downs between glacial, very cold, and interglacial warm times. One would have thought highly disruptive for life. And yet it wasn't so. If one looks at the fossil record, until very, very recently, there was no great increase in extinctions of different forms of life on Earth during all of these climatic ups and downs, even the quite marked ones. And that, of course, as we know, has very recently changed. The changes become apparent, not when humans appeared. The human species appeared about 300,000 years ago, we now know, from the fossil evidence. But for most of that time, there were just one species among many. It's only about 50,000 years ago, with what's called culturally modern humans, that then these wider effects became apparent. Extinctions of large mammals, and then a change in the landscape from 10,000 years ago, from this warm part of the ice ages, and of course all of the history that we know of agriculture, urbanization, and so forth. And yet again, that formed, if you like, a perspective, a setting, a kind of habitability from which another more recent change was recognized. Again, not long ago at all, just the year 2000, at the beginning of this millennium, Paul Crutzen, not a geologist, let alone a paleontologist, but an atmospheric chemist, suggested that this 10,000 years of the Holocene, a time of stability and pretty much consistent habitability on Earth for the biosphere, was changing. And it was changing in a way that he thought was big enough to justify another geological time interval. That he called the Anthropocene, which is again is part of the discussion we'll have today. And as Jerome said, I've been caught up, in the Anthropocene, not since the beginning, but since a few years after, once this Anthropocene idea began to be used by Paul and Will Steffen, who we sadly lost a week or so ago, as a working title for the time on Earth since industrialization, when things began to change. We as a group have been looking at both whether the Anthropocene geologically exists or not, on the time scale of 4 billion years, and also, as Jerome said, if we agreed that it did, then when should it begin? Because geological periods, whether it's the Carboniferous or Jurassic or whatever, must start fairly sharply and at the same time everywhere on Earth. That's simply part of the bureaucracy of time. So, broadly, what is the Anthropocene? This is, if you like, the line is the logo of the Anthropocene Working Group. And it shows broadly a horizontal line, which goes, marks about 10,000 years of time from the last ice age, right at the very right, going through the whole of the Holocene, pretty much, when climate, the biosphere, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, everything was pretty much stable, even as human life, human civilization was developing, as agriculture was developing, and as more and more of these human impacts were being seen. But nonetheless, the Earth as a system was still stable and consistently habitable in the same kind of way. And in the last 70 years, the line, this particular line shows the growth, the change in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that shows a steep vertical rise, which is still continuing. Looking at it as we did as a group, one could see that pretty much at the same time as atmospheric carbon dioxide rose, there were rises in all kinds of other things, species invasions and extinctions, a large perturbation to the nitrogen phosphorus cycle, lots of metals, new materials, novel materials, we call them, came on the scene, like pesticides and plastics, which have basically developed a global distribution within decades. And here's just one example of the change, again, of the addition of carbon from the ground into the air, which started sometime after the Industrial Revolution started to become noticeable, the late 19th century. But it's in the late 20th century that the really big carbon input from ground to air took place. And that just as one example, and here's a beautiful concept diagram by Anne-Sophie Milon, showing the idea that our carbon dioxide in the air is about 1 trillion tons, equivalent to a layer of pure gas about 1 meter thick, and growing about 1 millimeter every 2 weeks around us. So this just is one way to try and convey the reality of what is going on. And again, another part of the reality is harder to measure, but it's being measured. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. How much heat is it trapping? Well, that is now being measured in terms of units called zettajoules, which I don't understand at all, but the equivalent is pouring in now about 4 billion cups of hot tea like this into the sea every second. That is much more than the amount of energy we get from burning the fossil fuels, but it's the effect that the greenhouse gas has in warming the planet inexorably. Another change, this is a rather longer term one. Again, for about 10,000 years, as agriculture went on, the forests are being chopped down, progressively replaced by pasture and crop. And that has meant, once you add things up, that about half of life on Earth has gradually disappeared in terms of biomass over these last 10,000 years. And that has speeded up a bit, again, as everything else has done in the last century or two. Nonetheless, it's part of a slow process. This, though, is part of a quick process. And this is, again, another one of these extraordinary measurements made by a scientific group, not part of the AWG, but doing comparable work, looking at the growth of all the things that we build. The buildings we're in at the moment, the roads, the cars, the railways, and all of that, all of the functional, what's called anthropogenic mass. That has grown from a few % of the equivalent of Earth's biomass in the mid-20th century to now exceeding the weight of all life on Earth. in the last few years. Again, as part of the characterization of this extraordinary new change to the planet. And again, as part of that, humans are just a small part, of that mass, but nonetheless, amongst vertebrate biomass on land, humans are now about a third of the total weight. Most of the rest of that is our, what we call our domesticated animals that we keep to eat, and only a few percent, less than 5%, probably less than 3%, is all of the wild vertebrate terrestrial animals on Earth. And of course, a lot of that is driven, of course, by humans, but if you stand further back, it's not, humans have been around a long time. The real change here is, if you like, humans plus technology. The way that energy and matter are put together into now a very dynamic, very rapidly evolving, very big system, unlike anything else of the last 4 billion years of habitability, which, if you like, is one of the keys, perhaps the key, to really understanding what is going on in the Anthropocene. So I think, without further ado, that's my handing over point, to Bron, to try and understand the important question, which is the what and the why, and where are things going from here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. On va enchaîner. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go.
Okay.
We can see both the current slide and also the next one.
Oh, that's not right. Is it something to do with it's being shared? Maybe you're sharing the wrong screen.
Yeah, I think so. Is it a problem for you, or?
Well, it won't look good on the recording with it.
Okay.
So unshare and then share. No.
I think this is the same.
Is there not another choice?
No?
Well, is there some way we can?
I just try to.
Do that.
Is it okay for you right now? Can you see the full screen?
No, we still cannot see the full screen.
Okay.
Try again. That's strange.
Okay. Usually
that one.
That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Great, thank you. So a few weeks ago, we had a pre-meeting online to do a bit of planning for this, and with Roman and Sophie, and it was interesting. I mean, the idea we will have a debate afterwards, and as Jérôme said at the beginning, part of the format of your seminars, I understand, is to get 2 different points of view. And I did say at one point in the meeting, if you wanted a real argument between the social sciences and the natural sciences over the Anthropocene, you've probably chosen the wrong people in a way, because I mean, Jan and I have interacted a lot over the years, and certainly, as I think will become clear in my presentation, my way of thinking, of doing what I call planetary social thought, to use the name of the book I published with Nigel Clark a couple of years ago, that very much draws on the kind of late 20th century revolution of the in the earth sciences that the whole concept of the Anthropocene is based in. But let me just work out how to change slides. It's always difficult on a different left, isn't it? I want to left, right, up, down.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, Jan talked about the Anthropocene as an event in the earth, you know, and he showed you know, another version of that hockey stick diagram of CO2, you know, which has the sort of axis of well, that's probably 1,000-year graph there, isn't it? But, you know, you can have one you know, timelines in the literature that Jan is drawing on, which is and has, you know, been writing, contributing to of billions of years. But of course, it's also, the Anthropocene is an event in another way, in that it's an event in human time, in time of thought, you know, which is so the second graph there, you'll see there's the sort of bibliometric data about the overtaking of climate change by the term Anthropocene in the literature, you know. So we won't have time today to kind of talk about the detail of the, as it were, the sort of radiation of, you know, to use an evolutionary term, the radiation of the meme of the Anthropocene across the disciplines, you know. But that's clearly what's happened. But of course, as Jan said at the beginning, initially the real event, you know, the Anthropocene in another sense happened in 2000, when in the conference room in Mexico, here we go, hang on, Crutzen called out from the floor, allegedly. I don't think there's a recording of this, but, you know, and there's various different versions of what he actually said, but, you know, being frustrated by hearing the term Holocene coming out, and feeling that in this geosciences conference, there was a kind of a pressure building up in a way, you know, a sort of almost a sort of Kuhnian crisis, you know, to use the idea of Thomas Kuhn, you know, is our language adequate to capture the sort of changes that Jan was summarizing for us? And so he, you know, reaches for a new term, and although Eugene Sturmer had already been using this term, he came up with it independently. You know, we no longer live in the Holocene, we live in the, and, you know, the term came out and in this event. And I really like the fact that the term initially arose from the floor, not from the podium, if you like, you know, and originally it was a sort of outsider term, you know, but it's become an insider term. And then, like I say, to use the evolutionary metaphor, or, you know, in terms of what Jan was saying about life 500 million years ago, you know, being a very aquatic phenomenon, invading the land, and suddenly it's all the you know, the businesses going on the land, you know, most of the biomass. You know, I think probably there's been a similar transition where there's more literature in the humanities and social sciences using the term Anthropocene, I suspect, than in the natural sciences. So there's been a similar kind of radiation of this term through human thought, but it's also been received in very complex ways across the disciplines, refracted through disciplinary ways of thinking, but also causing its own little crises here and there, and sometimes just resonating with particular pre-existing currents and tensions within humanities and social science disciplines around the distinction between nature and culture, and ways of thinking about time and the human and technology and so on. So anyway, so much I could say about that. Okay. I really hate those things. Let's see if I can go right. Oh yeah, okay. So in terms of, I mean, the very word, of course, has got anthropos at the beginning, the Greek word for human. And it's clearly a huge opportunity for the social sciences and humanities because of the way that it blurs the boundary, it appears to blur the boundary, the idea of the Anthropocene, a humanized planet, a human age, humans as the geological force, blurs the boundary between nature and culture in a way that actually structuralist and post-structuralist philosophers and writers, many of whom from France, of course, since the 1970s, have been, arguing that we need to rethink the boundaries between nature and culture. And it was extraordinary to have messages coming from the earth sciences and geology that actually resonate with those more sort of intellectual arguments. And potentially places the human sciences, let's call them more generally, in a new position of power and influence in understanding the earth. Suddenly we should be, receiving loads of funding and being listened to much more about the future of the planet. But on the other hand, I think what's happened is the diversity of approaches across humanities and social science disciplines, but also within them, has been, as it were, exposed, a sort of guilty secret. I mean, we love the diversity and we love disagreeing with colleagues within our discipline more than we do with colleagues in other disciplines, and that's part of the way we drive forward and we create our careers and things like that by disagreeing with the people in the next office, as it were. But this is the problem, if you like, for a kind of problem-solving understanding of the Anthropocene. If we see it as a real, genuine challenge, in the way that your centre is doing, how can is this diversity a problem? And I think also Nigel and Clark and I would argue that the Anthropocene has exposed certain problems with social thought as it's emerged in European thought, and I'll say more about that later. Okay, so just to summarize, what is a huge, diverse area that needs, a 10-week course to really do justice to, but some rough summaries of the reception of how the Anthropocene thesis has been developed by Crutzen and Sturmer and Stefan and Jan and all these colleagues, how it's been received across the social sciences. There's one of the key tropes, if you like, is a sort of critique and a sort of recoiling from the term, and what it seems to imply. And so the usual critiques are that the very notion of the Anthropocene assumes this undifferentiated conception of the human, sort of species thinking in the very notion of the anthropos, neglecting the differential responsibility and power of different humans, both within and across nations and regions of the earth, and so on, genders and ethnicities, and so on. Also, it's often criticized for implying, at least, a historical determinism, failing to specify the specific institutions and practices responsible for environmental change. So people like Andreas Malm and Jason Moore have been pushing this alternative term of the Capitalocene as a naming of the kind of agent, if you like, that's driving these changes. And there's been lots of other alternative names as well. Interesting sort of linguistic playing with the term. And it's funny how the more people try to distance themselves from the Anthropocene term, the more they have to, as it were, get entangled with those ways of thinking. And I think that's been another kind of really interesting dynamic intellectually, is the sort of, the more people argue it with the term, the more actually it's shaping the way they think, even as they disavow it. Then thirdly, the critique has often been made that it takes the Western trajectory, if you like, and the periodicity of, you know, adopting agriculture, building cities, trade, fossil fuels, etc., a certain kind of periodization, which is basically taken from European and Euro-American history and neglecting much more complex set of changes, often in other directions, you know, and other parts of the planet. And that another critique is that it favors a scientific epistemology, is often seen as, even to talk about the planet or the species as a whole, is to take a sort of God's eye position, as if it's from outer space looking down, and, you know, a certain sort of objectivist approach, and neglecting all the tools that have been developed in the human sciences for contextualization and understanding, interpretation and meaning, and so on. And finally, of course, that it's anthropocentric, and in a way that's, you know, that's the point, in a way, that, you know, it's a sort of critical anthropocentrism, but, you know, this idea that actually maybe it overestimates human influence over the planet, because of course bacteria are still doing most of the work on the planet. So they're the kind of conventional critiques. And when Jan talked about various possible start dates for the Anthropocene, which is obviously what their group has been charged to try to make sense of, in terms of whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the contact with it between Europe and America, or the 1950s, you know, great acceleration. The point is often made that this is not to choose a particular start date is always political. You know, it maybe has certain kind of implications about technological determinism, or whether social relations of capitalism are more important than, you know, energy sources and things like that. And so, you know, that's the sort of standard critiques. And then there are different kind of roles we could imagine for the human sciences. So in this Brereton diagram, which is a sort of classic kind of model, you know, attempt to sort of model the whole physical system of the Earth, and you'll see that human activities are put into a particular box on the right-hand side, as if they can be sort of plugged into this sort of qualitative modeling. So that's one kind of model for the human and social sciences. But of course, often the social sciences are asked also to, and the arts as well, of course, to actually improve science communication, to turn what is sort of complex, turgid, you know, scientific prose into, you know, to help public understanding of science and things like that. So there's a certain kind of instrumentalization there. Or maybe, you know, the role of the human sciences is to take what the scientists say and then help turn it into normative ideas, talk about ethics, to talk about policy, to think about our obligations to future generations, and so on. So that's another model. And then another model, of course, of the role for the human sciences, which is what I've been talking about before, is a sort of critical role of challenging assumptions about the social within science, and also exposing knowledge power relations. So, for example, some of the bibliometric work on the IPCC, you know, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You know, there's been some interesting work showing how all the authors either come from Euro-American centers of intellectual power in North America and Western Europe, or they did their PhDs with people who did, you know. And these are important questions about how, you know, what are the relations of power and how knowledge is made about the Earth. You know, we might want to relativize, decolonize scientific knowledge. But I think something I want to just move on to now for the rest of my talk is how maybe social thought itself needs to change. So rather than just deploying the mechanisms we have already in these kind of complex ways, maybe we need to take seriously what we called in the subtitle of our book, the Anthropocene challenge to the social sciences. So in Planetary Social Thought, sorry, only available in English at the moment, we argue that the sort of developments in the earth sciences that Jan talked briefly about, but is very much part of this world, pose huge challenges. We should treat them as a challenge rather than something we can quickly, throw down like a glass of water or whatever. It's something that kind of sticks in the throat, and actually maybe we need to kind of redesign our throats to really, intellectually speaking, metaphorically speaking, to be able to absorb what we're being told about the way the earth works. But also great opportunities for social thought. And the key argument in the book, I suppose, I think this is probably taken from the back cover, this quote, that the world transforming powers of human social life, which Jan was talking about, particularly, I can't remember how he periodized it exactly, but that with killing off all the large mammals and agriculture and cities, and then building the technosphere, anthropogenic materials and everything, as always, the powers of humans to do that, to actually transform the planet, to force Paul Crutzen from the floor to interrupt and try and coin a new term. This has always depended on humans forging relations with the inhuman potentialities of the planet. So that's what we're trying to rethink. So going back, to the discovery of deep time, and it was lovely walking past the, along Rue Cuvier, from the hotel this morning, and the way deep time was discovered by geologists, but also by miners, discovering these strange fossils, these traces of monsters in the ground, and in the book, we talk about how this was received within European thought by people like Kant and Hegel as well, understanding what these discoveries, as you go down into the earth and apparently back in time, reveal all these revolutions, to use Kant's terms, which include certainly many ancient organic beings no longer alive on the surface of the earth that preceded the existence of man, and how many are still in prospect, hidden by the surface of the earth by our inquiring gaze. So what we argue in the book is that there was this potential here for a revolutionary understanding of the human as a sort of brief period, as part of this long, deep time understanding of the earth. But that actually, in the European thought, European social thought, recoils away from that to construct an idea of the modern subject and of the human being as somehow exempt from natural forces, as standing outside nature. And so the very origin of sociology, particularly my own maternal discipline, as it were, is based on this idea that social facts, Durkheim said, are only to be explained by other social facts, not natural facts. It's that sort of separation of realms. And what we're saying is a kind of a geopolitical event where European thought was confronted by the Lisbon earthquake and by discoveries of the earth, and I think this idea of deep time. But then it recoils in this fit of panic, as Nick Land called it, and recoils into this idea of the modern subject. So what we argue in the book is that we need to try to think not just about the planet, but through the planet. And so we take various examples of social life and show how they can be analysed in a planetary way. So I think what we're saying here is, in a way, that the Anthropocene as a concept, as Jan described it, emerges. Its precondition, if you like, intellectually, is the revolution in the earth sciences that happens in the 1960s and 1970s. As the earth sciences moves towards a more catastrophic understanding of Earth history, the Theia collision that Jan talked about, the snowball Earth, the meteorite impacts, also tectonics, and land emerging and being pulled down, being accepted, evolution being punctuated by these bursts rather than being gradual, but also the idea that the very systemic nature of the Earth, the biosphere, what emerges into the Gaia hypothesis, its very interconnectedness of the Earth also makes the Earth vulnerable to othering itself, to becoming other to itself over time in the way that Jan described. And we're very much inspired by a lot of Jan's writing, about this. So the two main concepts we use in the book to kind of go through the Anthropocene concept into what we see as we propose as a way of thinking the social in a planetary way, are planetary multiplicity and then earthly multitude. So planetary multiplicity for us is, again, inspired by a phrase that Jan used about when you look at the Earth over the 4.5 billion years of its history, it appears to us as many planets rather than one. So our concept of planetary multiplicity is the idea that planets are not just other to each other, but they're other to themselves on all spatial and temporal scale. That sort of internal differentiation of the Earth as a far from equilibrium system driven by heat escaping from its core, but also from solar radiation coming in, means that the Earth is always othering itself. Even the atmosphere above our heads, above Paris, has to reconstruct itself every day and become other to itself in layers. And the Earth has composed itself into all these different parts, including ourselves, with different powers over its lifetime. So planetary multiplicity is this sense we have of planetary self-differentiation, which is always a challenge to humans, but also an opportunity. And earthly multitude is our term for shared ways of responding to both the resources and the opportunities and the threats opened up by planetary self-ordering. So that would include sort of the use of open burning that Australian Aboriginal peoples evolved over thousands of years to adapt to a slowly changing climate, but also the way that the different powers of the parts of the Earth, of the ocean, of the air, of metals, of ores and things can be brought into relation with each other. So our idea here is that social life always has this material planetary basis. So what we're saying here is to think in a planetary way is not always to go up into space and look down as the planet as a whole. It's actually about going down and understanding the kind of geological conditions for social life, which can often, rather than blurring difference between humans and different human groups and practices, can actually intensify our understanding of the differences between them. So it's a kind of radicalization of that kind of critical differentiation that critical social science do. And a lot of that is to do with our engagement with materials. And so we use these different methods in the book to talk to analyze different social phenomena in these sort of planetary terms. And I mean, I'm just going to quickly cycle through them. So the geohistorical term is to look at, as it were, the sort of lineages and transitions that have happened in the Earth that social life depends on, including the origin of, the evolution of animals and technology and so on. So it's a certain kind of filiation, if you like, of preconditions, the way that what we can do depends on what the Earth has done before us, and so powers that have been passed on to us by the Earth. But also we talk about meta patterns, which are solutions which are made available to different living and non-living systems in the Earth because of the nature of the Earth. So when Jan talked about the way the sort of changes that humans have done, we try to, as it were, deprivilege those and talk about the way that living things find solutions to moving around, for example. So one of Jan's colleagues, Peter Haff, has talked a lot about the way the evolution of the technosphere, which Jan showed in all those graphs, and particularly the movement of materials around the Earth, can be seen as a solution that the Earth has discovered through us to the problem of how to move solids around the Earth, and how the Earth can exploit the sort of differential concentration of minerals and ores and energy within the Earth, and actually put it to work and transform itself. And so that's another sort of idea that we draw on, this idea of a sort of general library, if you like, of solutions to problems that the Earth makes available to living things that we are exploiting, but other animals and systems do as well. We also use this method we call speculative and comparative planetology, which is the idea of comparing the Earth to other planets. And although Jan was saying, yes, I mean, the Earth does seem more and more a very abnormal planet, we want to say that we can think reflectively, both through planetary science, astrophysics, but also through science fiction and speculation about what other planets can do to reflect differently about the uniqueness of the Earth. So seeing alienness within the Earth, if you like, that the Earth contains signs of what planets could have done that might be very different from life on the Earth, sort of parallel biospheres or other trajectories that the Earth might have taken if it hadn't become the mature, life-dominated planet as we have now. And then finally, stratal analysis is crucial, where we talk about how I can't explain. There's aerial top dressing of crops, or the sort of meat industry, as it sort of particularly was industrialized around Chicago, is sort of examples of the way that human power is often about connecting the different strata of the Earth, the soil, the air, the deep, carboniferous deposits and so on. So how you can analyze everything that we're doing, like in this room, we could go through, how the powers of what is happening in this room and the way we're sharing our images with Jan and everything, rely on making connections between the strata of the Earth. So I just want to end on 3 thoughts, I suppose, one last slide. Is to connect it back to this theme of habitability, and Jan was more generous than I have, I think, have been connecting the talk to the habitability theme. So I think one thing that it will be really interesting to think through is the way that earthly multitudes, this concept that Nigel Clark and I developed as to describe these informal collectives, whether traditional, modern, or new, or emerging, or not yet born, collectives that have kind of skilled, craft-based, trial and error, embodied, embedded, shared knowledge about how to take advantage of the self-differentiating powers of different parts of the Earth, whether it's metallurgy or weaving together fabrics and creating new kind of structures, or different forms of motion, or engaging with the rest of the biosphere. How, I suppose, because one of the points we're making is that the modernity, the great acceleration that Jan has talked about has depended in a way on the sidelining of those kind of informal, hands-on engagement with the Earth. I mean, something that Nigel likes to say is, what would it be like? Imagine a society where instead of each house having a car, an internal combustion engine outside, which it uses to drive around, what if each house had a kiln instead? Not a different way of chambering fire, not to move, but to transform ceramics and metal and things like that, and so what kind of futures can we imagine where earthly multitudes are more proliferate, this kind of more hands-on material knowledgeable engagement with the powers, the material powers of the earth. And then secondly, to kind of expand out from that, how has that human technosphere that Jan talked about historically created habitable zones in one planet, like this lovely, you know, habitable atmosphere we have in this room, by at the same time exposing other humans and non-humans to the Earth's variability. And in the book, we, you know, tell that story about the way European social thought insulated itself from recognizing the challenge of deep time and planetarity, as also having this material component as well, about how Europe materially insulated itself from, you know, made itself a very comfortable place through unequal ecological and material exchange with the rest of the earth, and by exposing certain kinds of other populations, be it their own kind of minors, but also, you know, enslaved populations and colonized populations to Earth's variability. So there's something there that needs decolonizing, I think. And then finally, I suppose, and I just have to leave that hanging, is how deep time and multiplanetary thinking, and particularly trying to be away from, I mean, Jan quite rightly said, you know, we need to, implied, I think, that we need to really treasure this kind of, this jewel of the Earth's living environment, because it could be the only one that there is. I mean, this is absolutely true, but can we also deterrestrialize our thinking about other kind of ways that planets might be habitable, that might not involve them having temperatures around the triple point of water, and you know, being a sort of in this Goldilocks zone and having biological life. Maybe non-living planets could also do extraordinary things and have their own versions of habitability. Thank you.
So, c'est le bouton en bas. Il faut faire le bouton rouge, t'appuies longtemps dessus. Ok, attends.
So, okay, thank you, Bro. Thank you, Jan. So we are now opening the floor to questions, and then we will have a debate or a discussion around the different concepts that have been developed both by Jan and Bron on the Anthropocene. So first we can take questions on either Jan's talk or Bron's talk.
And if you have any question on the chat, on the Zoom, do not hesitate to put it on the chat or to raise your hand.
This is a question for Jan. What are the prospects of the stratigraphy committee actually sort of making a decision about the Anthropocene and when it starts? I mean, I think it matters less exactly when it starts, to me at least, than kind of the process get completed. What are the prospects of that happening anytime soon?
Okay, yes, that's a central question, which again, Bron as well as I might comment on this one. As to when the Anthropocene could be said to have started, that decision has already been taken. The working group, at least, for what that's worth, had a vote a couple of years ago, and by large majority decided that sometime in the mid-20th century, so around about 1950, give or take a few years, is the key transition where one might put a Holocene Anthropocene boundary, because of the kind of data I very briefly showed you, and much more of that kind, which said that the Earth as a planet developed new patterns, new styles of working, new functions over that relatively brief interval, of what's called, I think in France lately, glorieuses, or the post-World War II boom and all of that. In that, now to get a precise beginning of the Anthropocene, that depends on the process going on at the moment of choosing a reference section from somewhere around the world within what one might call modern strata, to pin down an exact level to the nearest year, and in fact we'll try and include within it to the nearest day, or maybe even the nearest second, when the Anthropocene should be started. Now this is, if you like, a formal decision. This is geology we're trying to do, and every time unit, everywhere, whether it's back in the Precambrian, or in the Jurassic, or here, has to have a single sharp beginning. And that's just really for the purpose of science, of measurement. It's the same logic as a second should be the same all the world round, in terms of its length. And a meter should be the same length. A kilogram should be the same weight. It's so that one can make systematic comparisons when we're talking about rates of climate change or biodiversity loss, or the kind of processes that Bron talked about, the human processes of, did things work much faster, in 1960 than they did in 1880 and so forth, to have a common boundary. Now, we recognize, and again, this is something that, one can get from the way that Bron was saying, that history is continuous and seamless, and always has been, often gradational. So these geological time boundaries are there for the purposes of trying to increase understanding, trying to help discussion, trying to help comparison in that. And that process, is it's a slow process because it involves a lot of data in geology to try and find the exact level, which can be traced around the world as effectively as possible. But that is that's going on right now. The search is underway. In fact, it's well underway for what's called a golden spike. The reference section somewhere, where the Anthropocene will be said to formally begin. Whether that will be accepted by all of the commissions and committees above us in the working group, that's another story. The Anthropocene, as Bron has said, is controversial within geology just as much as outside. To have an epoch just a human lifetime long is definitely bizarre. Just as the Earth as a living planet is definitely bizarre for a planetologist. So there's much to go, but the process is taking place very actively, very energetically, and it's really illuminating as to how precisely one can measure and monitor Earth history, including those aspects, which are mediated or driven by human action.
Thank you, Jan. If I may, I have a question, which is a follow-up question to you and Bron. First question is, are there social scientists in the Anthropocene working groups? And second question is, what does it change? I mean, this problem of defining the start of the Anthropocene to the Anthropocene as a frontier object, so to say, between social sciences and natural sciences, which is to me the main advantage Ron said during this talk.
Okay, well, if I can start with the first part of the question. Yes, the Anthropocene Working Group is the only stratigraphic working group on any part, of the geological timescale to have significant social sciences representation. So let us say maybe about half, a little more than half of the Anthropocene Working Group are, if you like, classical geologists, paleontologists, stratigraphers like myself. And the other half are other kinds of academic discipline, which include things like glaciology, earth system science, but also they include archaeology, the history of science, notably, with that, people like Naomi Oreskes, who works, at the boundary between science and public policy. On that, archaeology, is represented. So from the beginning, it's been very multidisciplinary as a group, which has made for, it's not been a simple life, but it's been an extremely interesting life, within that group. In there, and as for the other, I mean, what is the use of having the Anthropocene? I think from, if you like, the old-fashioned paleontologist point of view, it's real. It's very real, very distinct, very well marked. It is possibly the most well marked geological interval I know, even though it's only 70 years old for now. On that, and therefore, as a distinct phenomenon, it deserves a name, and it deserves characterization and in geology definition. It's real. It has ramifications in all kinds of directions. Again, which Bron is far better than I to discuss than I am.
You want to add something?
Yeah, sure. It would have been lovely to be part of the Anthropocene Working Group. It would have been, fantastic. But in some ways, it's quite nice being on the outside as well, and being able to, cheer on this group. This really interesting group doing this amazing work. I just remembered actually in Paris, I did a performance. It was about 2013 in an Anthropocene conference, which was a kind of spoof of Jan's group, actually. I don't know if anyone ever read it. It's published now as a book chapter, a book edited by Clive Hamilton and others, and it's called The Onomatophore of the Anthropocene. And so I basically read out as their representative on Earth the decision of an intergalactic commission on planetary ages, which was the only body in our galaxy that has the authority to pronounce the name of planetary ages, and particularly to name the entity who after which the age is named. So so it was quite nice being on the outside and being able to sort of do a sort of friendly kind of satire in a way. What would a cosmic non-terrestrial theory of planetary aging look like? What might the science look like? And what would the decision be? What would they decide? Would they decide that humans have the right to A, name an age of their own planet, and B, name it after themselves? But it's interesting to see the group homing in on that sort of 1950s-ish date, and I think that is a really interesting time to think through. That certainly the great extent, as well as the stuff about atom bomb layers and the kind of synchronistic layer across the Earth, which geologists need. I think the great acceleration graphs are really important to think with, what actually happened there. There's lots of different ways of understanding that as an Earth event, about this explosion energy use and building and movement of materials and things. But I think the way that social scientists united use the term is much more kind of it's not necessarily reliant on the detail of the science that is done by anthropology. And there's a bad side to that, I think. I think that a lot of my colleagues don't spend enough time and get enough, getting the most that could be got out of the detailed work of people like Jan. But on the other hand, I think there's a good, slippage there, a generative and creative slippage that people will use, even if the term anthropocene is rejected by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. It's out there. It's already colonized the land, if you like, and it will be generating its own thinking in art and humanities and novels and theory, and I think that's good. I mean, just one thing I would say, something that Nigel and Clark and I have been thinking about is, if we really are in a transition between states of the earth, so Jan has kind of pinpointed a second, the second which we moved from the whole thing to Anthropocene. But of course, in reality, view that from an Earth systems perspective, these things are often strange, gradual transitions where you start, and there are certain kind of patterns that system scientists spot where a system is moving to a bifurcation point. The kind of, for example, the timescales of phenomena start to shift in interesting ways. A transition is coming, or potentially coming. So we're in this transition, but there's also, let's remember that the Anthropocene is, we're not just naming it and defining it, we're making it as well. So it's a very odd, which is something I've written about, in that we don't just know it, we're causing it and making it, and we can choose, in some sense, to some extent, as a species or as societies, which way it goes. So that makes it a bit hard to know what it is. And so I think we need to think about what kind of knowledge we need in the middle of a transition, in a threshold. This is something where we have to accept that trying to have certain knowledge is no longer appropriate, that we need a certain more pragmatist knowing through doing. I often think of the wonderful story by Edgar Allan Poe about the guy whose boat has been wrecked in a maelstrom. He's going round and round, and he's trying not to go stuck down into the whirlpool. And he has to observe all the debris around him, how it's moving, and start to realise, okay, look at bits of wood of this size go down, and these ones go up. Okay, I'm going to go on to this. I think that's where we are now. And it's partly, we need to, be very generative and imaginative in the understanding of what it is to know in the Anthropocene.
There is also a question on someone raised his hand on Zoom, so JKV. You can ask a question.
Yes, hello, I'm Jeremy Cave. I'm a scholar in sustainability science at IRD, and I've been working with solid waste issues for a long time, so I'm quite concerned about the waste Ocene, as we call it. Thank you very much for the two very interesting and very rich presentations. It's been a little bit difficult for me to grasp all the concepts that have been exposed here. I have like 4 or 5 comments I would like to share, or questions, but feel free to answer any of each. At the end of your presentation, Jan, you said that the technosphere was probably a key in this Anthropocene, in the understanding of the Anthropocene. So I would like to hear you further on this point, if possible. Second comment, I was wondering where the Gaia theory and interdependence of elements within the Earth system has been mentioned by Bronislaw, I think. But even for Jan, I would like to understand how does this theory interacts with your own understanding of the Anthropocene and, you know, I don't know, the scenarios of this changing habitability on Earth. Because Latour, which created the Centre des Politiques de la Terre, was very much interested in that theory and somehow, in France at least, participated to rehabilitate it. Third comment is you've mentioned, Jan, many times this idea of habitability crisis. I'm part of initiative in France, which is called Atecopole, Atelier d'écologie politique, which has stand up to make public these Anthropocene issues towards non-universitary people. And one of our basic statement is like, we should stop formulating things in terms of ecological crisis, because this implies that we will come back to some statu quo, previous status quo. And so would it seem to you, to both of you, appropriate to talk about Anthropocene as a new human condition, if we say that there is more carbon in the atmosphere than 4 million years ago, and species are going extinct in an unprecedented way since 65 million years ago? Can we talk about a new human condition? And fourth comment to Bronislaw, does your formulation in terms of planetary social thought resonates with the Deepesh Chakrabarty's distinction between the global and the planetary in his 2021 book, The Climate History in a Planetary Age? And maybe fifth comment, if you allow me, what this stratal analysis you somehow invite us to develop. How does it articulate with the critical zones understanding of Earth habitability that once again Bruno Latour and others have contributed to put forward? And maybe one last question is, do you have examples of interesting way of thinking society through the planet? Thank you very much for your attention.
Right. Well, maybe if I start with this, yes, excellent questions. You may have to remind me of one or two as we go through. But I really like the idea of the Wasteocene. That's a new one on me, and very apt, I think. And had that term come to Paul Crutzen instead of Anthropocene, you know, way back in 2000, in some ways, our discussions about this new epoch, this new condition, as you call it, may have been rather simpler on that. But waste is certainly a huge part, you know, of what we're doing, of the, if you like, of the characterization, the geological characterization of the Anthropocene. Yes, crisis. Yes, I'm sorry, I use that word very loosely. And I use it rather with my reflexes as a paleontologist. You know, thinking about things which were definite crises back in the past. If you like, the great oxidation event. You know, the time at the end of the Ordovician period, when a lot of the fossils that Jérôme mentioned, I studied the Graptolites, died out, almost became extinct. That was definitely a crisis for them in that, and yet others, the end Cretaceous event that, you know, has been called a crisis in geology, and of course it was, because it degraded large parts of the biosphere very quickly. And of course, we're looking back and compressing in time a bit. So the idea, of course, that we're going through something which will come out the other side to come back into Holocene conditions or Holocene-like conditions, that is now probably not the case, at least not on any kind of human timescales, and probably not even on geological timescales. My colleague again in history, Julie Adeney Thomas, who's thought a lot about the Anthropocene, uses the word predicament for it, which is, as you were saying, a new kind of condition which will not go away, which will probably intensify and develop, that we collectively will have to try and live with somehow. So the business of trying to work out what we're doing with enormous amounts of waste, which is going out all the time, into the wider environment is part of that. So yes, a crisis, I think, was an awkwardly chosen term, and there are better ones for that. The technosphere, well, again, Bron mentioned Peter Haff, who was a member of the working group, again, he is half geologist, half engineer, half philosopher, and half something we can't work out at all. But he has developed the idea of the technosphere as a system. So if you like, it has the same relation to us as, let's say, the biosphere has to individual animal and plant species. So individual animal plant species, together form something which has its own characters, its own dynamics, which are only loosely connected to the life and death of a living animal or plant in there. And the same, lithosphere, cryosphere, atmosphere, and so on. And the technosphere seems to us a useful perspective, to have, in that it's clearly, it's clearly very big. It's now probably comparably energetic to the whole of the biosphere. It is evolving terribly quickly. It is generating huge amounts of waste, which is not recycling, and all of that. And it also puts humans in a position of being caught up within something that, has been, of course, human created in inverted commas, but nobody is directing the technosphere or guiding it. It is evolving under numerous influences and impulses and propulsions and inventions of different kinds. So it's useful in that way. It has a kind of, is the technosphere Gaia in a spacesuit? Well, possibly. I thought Bruno Latour's resurrection of the Gaia concept and its explanation as something not simplistic, but nevertheless, a useful perspective, one that, as Bruno said, it changed, in James Lovelock's mind, evolved in its own way in that. But nonetheless, it's again, I don't understand Gaia at all, but even less than I understand the technosphere. But I have a feeling that it has a valid part, in these discussions, that we're trying to have in there. And certainly Bruno, and people like Tim Lenton made very, useful and enlightening comments, about it in that. So it has some relation, to the biosphere. It has some relation to the technosphere, and again, it's a way of trying to understand processes which otherwise we might find hard to grasp, because there are so many of them and they're so complicated and they're moving so quickly. Sorry, if I'm sure I've missed other parts of your questions in there before we go on to those to Bron.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just moved away from that camera. I was pointing at my nose. It's not very nice for anyone viewing online. Yeah, I mean, fantastic set of questions from Jeremy and great answers from Jan. I mean, the waste scene, interesting. I mean, Jan talked about the great oxygenation event, you know, when the biosphere collapsed by 90% of it died off, you know, in terms of its mass, you know, billions of years ago. And actually that was a waste of scene in a way. It was what is seen, you know, in the sense of being an epoch, you know, we have to learn what it means to put scene on the end of something. And this is, relates to Timothy Lenton and Andrew Watson's work on the revolutions of the Earth and what we can learn from previous crises in the Earth, the ones that Jan talked about, that are typically caused by the overproduction of some noxious substance which the biosphere does not at that time have the capacity to recycle, and it builds up, you know, and it poisons everything, you know. And so this is where one of the understandings of what, you know, if the technosphere is a new sphere of the Earth, as well as it being odd in that it's made up of things like laptops and humans and pigs and electricity wires, it's also unusual because it's not being, you know, it's building up all this waste. But we can see in deep time that is an old story, and in the past, the Earth, and of course there's an observer bias here, you know, like on other planets where those cycles weren't closed, you know, life might have died out. We are, by definition, a planet on which solve those problems. But, you know, so this is one question: will the technosphere evolve? You know, this is sort of work of Adam Frank in astrobiology, you know, general theory of technospheres, you know, for other planets, but they have to somehow, you know, connect with the biosphere in a sustainable way. Yeah, I mean, I've thought a bit about the technosphere myself. I just published a paper on infrastructures as a planetary phenomena, and I do think it's a very interesting concept of, you know, like I was saying that Peter Happ has given us this idea of the technosphere as a having its own endogenous rules that we have to follow. And in some of my writing, I sort of think about maybe late planets, you know, so our planet is probably entering its second half of its life, you know, because it can be swallowed up by the sun in another 5 billion years. So maybe in the late time, you know, the late period of planets' lives, maybe that's when they develop these much more complex self-organizing spheres, whether they're biospheres or technospheres or something completely different. So maybe both the biosphere and the technosphere of the Earth are just our particular terrestrial examples of a late planetary sphere. How we describe the Anthropocene as a new human condition? I mean, a slide I jumped over because I didn't have time was trying to sort of mention some of the different, as it were, political responses to the Anthropocene concept. And crudely speaking, you know, there are some responses which are, oh my gosh, the Anthropocene is a sort of dystopia, and, you know, a dystopia is by definition a warning of what will happen if we don't act. So therefore we must sort of revert back into the Holocene, you know, this track, you know, we're going onto this motorway and it's all a highway to hell, so it's reversed off split road back into the Holocene. So that's one kind of attempt to respond, you know, to live within planetary boundaries, to maybe geoengineer back to pre-industrial climates and things like that. And then there's another wing which are more, you know, okay, if we are the god species, if we are now planetary managers, you know, we've accidentally made a humanized planet, but let's do it consciously and become stewards of the planet, which is more sort of technophilic rather than technophobic. And then there are other more interesting middle positions, I think. People like Holly Jean Buck, who are trying to find a space in the middle, and, you know, Latour, I think, in a way, and Donna Haraway in the States, trying to find a sort of position in the middle, which is embracing a new understanding of dealing with the Earth, which is neither becoming planetary managers, nor imagining that we can reverse back out. And certainly in our thinking, Gaia and critical zones have been really important. I suppose for me, Gaia theory is important because particularly the sort of cybernetic understanding of Gaia that Lynn Margulis was mainly brought into the picture with her work with Lovelock, that has been very influential for me through engaging with people like Sebastian Detrey and Bruce Clark, who have been also reinterpreting all that kind of stuff. But I suppose what's different in what Nigel and I are doing, and one is that although, yes, the critical zones, so the idea of this sort of zone where there is life, the biosphere, between the deep roots of the trees to the, the top of the boundary, atmospheric boundary layer where life basically stops. That's a really great place to think. But actually, Nigel and I also argue that we have to think about how we engage with the non-living parts of the earth, and often that is not about this sort of entanglement and relationality and interdependency that we have learned from ecological thinking and from Gaian thinking, but it's often about how we have to form relations with parts of the earth which are utterly disregard us, that we depend on, but don't depend on us, particularly rock, the powers of rocks and metals and ores and things like that, that we literally stand on, but also metaphorically, but also outer space as well. So I think, although we're very sort of inspired by Gaia and critical zones and Bruno's work, which has emphasized very much the uniqueness of the living earth, we think we also need to take a lot of those ideas and expand it out, both beneath the biosphere, but also above it.
Yeah, I would have the last question, I guess, because I'm Nathalie Blanc, and I'm a geographer and the director of the Center for Politiques, and I must just correct Jeremy because Bronislaw didn't create the center, we just a group who created the center. Following it's through a program that Bronislaw directed at the time. So first of all, and I would like to say something from a political point of view. I think that all critiques addressed to the Anthropocene concept come from a political point of view. For example, if you think of the Habitabilites, it is a way to address who is responsible for what and who must redress or correct what is governing us through the Anthropocene observation. So, and also there are all different kind of critique addressed to the Anthropocene, especially because when facing such observation, you feel very helpless. I mean, and you don't find ways of addressing the question. I mean, it's so massive in terms of temporal and spatial scales that how do you address this question, politically speaking? So I think this has to do with scales. I mean, something has to do in between collective and individual scales. It has also to do with temporal scales. And I was wondering how much you introduce this idea of scales and political non-helplessness. I mean, it's easy to portray or depict such a portrait, but how do you give the tools for people just to do something about it and not just tell them this cracking part of our helplessness?
Right. That's, yes, that's an interesting and a difficult question. Particularly, for if you like an old-fashioned paleontologist of the worst kind, like me. In terrain which is quite new and quite disconcerting. that we have stumbled upon in, in working on this idea of the Anthropocene, which does, as you say, it's not a happy concept. It's quite a disquieting concept. It says there is a lot of trouble in the world, which can be measured geologically, and defined in the amount of microplastics and deep sea sediments, in the amount of persistent organic pesticides in different kinds of soils and deposits around the world, in rises in atmospheric gases, temperature, in losses in biosphere, and so on. And of course, that is one part. And in geology, it's even worse, because in geology and in this work on the Anthropocene, it is basically descriptive. In that it is simply trying to, if you like, diagnose recent planetary history, again using planetary in the sense of Dipesh Chakrabarty in that useful distinction he made, in that to try and then put it in the perspective of the whole of deep time, which has got a long and complicated history, which I rushed through in a very cartoon-like fashion. So that is, if you like, a simple diagnosis. And even worse, and on the working group, we're very aware that the Anthropocene is the only proposed geological epoch, geological time of it all, which has social and political consequences. In that none of the others do. So how you define the Jurassic or the Carboniferous or whatever, is a matter for geologists only, and quite abstract for much else. In the Anthropocene is not at all abstract, because we live in it and we live through it, and it's a different perspective. And many, in if you like, the geopolitics going on, many of my colleagues are intensely uncomfortable with the kind of perspective that the Anthropocene is showing and is bringing to light, and is bringing, if you like, abstract geology, into this new kind of setting. So within the working group, of course, we cannot, if you want to preserve the idea, proffer solutions, to this predicament, again, as Julia Thomas put it, and has been talked about. But of course, one of the businesses of the geological time, it should be useful. So, the Jurassic is useful for people who want to find oil, for instance, in there. The Anthropocene, is at least a description and might help give a sense of priorities in this kind of perspective. It also is quite integrative. I think that's, again, another part of geology. You put different kinds of evidence together, on the same page, on the same graph, and you then hope to see how they interact, and which are the, if you like, the larger stories and which are the smaller stories within that. But of course, the Anthropocene is so big, there are so many changes, that your point that you can look at it and lose hope is again something we're well aware of. I don't know the answer to that, except through myriad different kinds of activities which in some way address one or other point of the Anthropocene. Our colleague recently just made the very good question on waste. Making greater awareness of waste, where it's going, what it's doing, and then dealing with it, putting resources towards that, is, if you like, part of a way of dealing with a predicament. Others of, the sadly late Will Stephan was highly active, in climate committees and so on, very active and effective in that, as well as being on the Anthropocene working group and working on this, if you like, abstract, non-political, definitive issue, that it's trying to resolve. Again, another member, Naomi Oreskes, who has just brought out, co-authored a wonderful paper saying that oil companies knew very well, from their own climate models decades ago, the effect of burning fossil fuels, and they kept quiet about it. Now, in the sense of trying to embarrass some of the major players, in if you like, the production of climate change, that is again, another way of trying to, if you like, add some negative feedback to the whole process of, Anthropocene evolution, in that, so, I guess possibly once, all of the official, the bureaucratic dust has settled, personally, I will be more interested in trying to do something exactly like that, trying to do something concrete, about resolving the predicament, than in, if you like, academic disputations, on what the Anthropocene may or may not be. But for the moment, I'm afraid I'm trapped within the academic disputations. But we're aware, of the ramifications.
Yeah, just to add a few thoughts to that. I mean, it's a great question, and I think in some ways you can see the Anthropocene concept is joining a number of other concepts that emerge at a similar kind of time that have a similar role as a sort of portmanteau or gathering together. And Gaia as well, in its own way as well, a sort of meta theory that can gather together a number of what could be seen as separate environmental problems under one heading. And in that way, to point out their systemic interconnection, economic growth and energy use and pollution and biodiversity loss and the built environment and something, like I remember teaching a course on the Anthropocene a few years ago, and it was the first time I managed, I taught a course on environmental sociology basically, but I pitched it one year to master graduate students that it was all about the Anthropocene, and so all these media and cultural studies students, people who studied fashion and media and digital and marketing came to the course because I basically was able to say it's all Anthropocene now. Anthropocene includes everything. It includes animals, devices, clothes, ideas of the future, and it was, so in that way, it's very powerful way of putting together a sort of systemic call alarm. But I suppose, on the other hand, I think it's very geological logic. I would admit there is a danger in that as well, because I think when people, and certainly when I've talked to non-academics, and I mentioned this term, Anthropocene, explain it. It can have this very fatalistic feel. Oh, right, we're in Anthropocene now. Okay, so it's all over, basically. So it has that sort of, can have that danger. It doesn't always resonate as much. So I'm not surprised it's not used that much in campaigning organisations. I think the technosphere can be politicised in particular ways. In that once and some people like Andrew Jarvis I work with at Lancaster, we've been sort of working through empirically some of the Peter Haft's arguments about what are the implicit rules that seem to be generated by the technosphere about how it captures energy and materials and grows and constrains its parts to behave in particular ways that contribute to the growth of the technosphere, and trying to put kind of numbers on that, whether we're looking at particular parts of the built environment or national economies. You start to see these self-organizing patterns, and then you can also start to see the possible exit routes. You've got to understand the machine we're part of and how it operates in order to see what room for agency there is. So I think there are some political clues there in the technosphere concept. And I just one last thought, which is more speculative stuff that I've been doing with Nigel. One of the performances I've done a couple of times in Germany and in Sweden is on a bus. It was on a field trip. It was a geological field trip, the last one, yeah, and it was going to these Cambrian formations in southern Sweden. And I did this performance where it's called How to Dismantle a Bus. And it's basically, we take the ensemble of the coach and the driver and all the passengers, including myself, rocking around in the aisle with my microphone. And we analyze it as an entity which is produced by the earth, by a certain kind of collecting, gathering of powers of the earth into this moving, like a megafauna rolling along the road, you know, using stored energy and limbs underneath that allows it to move along the road and steer and things like that. So positioning it within that great story of the earth that Jan is so brilliant at telling. But also in the second half of the performance, I imagined if we say, what would it mean to decompose this? And this is where how people move together becomes political. You know, the very word bus comes from omnibus, which means for all, but of course buses aren't for all. Only certain people can get on buses, and certain shapes of bodies, you know, the able-bodied and having the fare. And when we get on a bus, there's a certain division of labour between who decides the destination and who's carried and who is luggage and who's stored. So by the end of the performance, we're sort of in this hallucinatory mode of imagining a kind of recomposition of how we move together as a caravan, a metazoa, a kind of collection of animal bodies and other kinds of entities and eddies in the air that could reorganize and care for each other in different ways and achieve our destinations in different ways. So I think their planetary thinking can suggest new forms of politics, I think.
Thank you. We can take a really last question, and then we can conclude that.
Thank you, Bernadette Massot-Vincent. So I wanted to ask you, Jan, kind of question from an epistemological perspective. I really admire the way the working group tries to define and determine the onset date as a matter of fact and the golden spike. And because it's really a kind of heroic endeavor, you know, trying to reach a matter of fact when there are so many political challenges, as Bronislaw mentioned, you know, on behind this question. But at the same time, I wonder whether it is worthwhile to try to come up with one golden spike and one on day. We learn so much from the academic disputations that are going on today among the different candidates between for the golden spike, plutonium, carbon, plastic, everything. And what we learn is that they are all good candidates, and that it's a platform to start questioning the interactions between these different elements and their temporal trajectories, rather than trying to sort out which is the one that we want to elect. And it could be more interesting to keep the controversy open, you know, in my opinion, and to keep it and look at it as a starting point for a new kind of science, dealing with the interaction between all these temporal trajectories, rather than speaking only in terms of time scales, in terms of a variety of multiple temporal trajectory of the inhabitants of the planet.
Yes, I have sympathy with both those points of view and those suggestions. You know, firstly, that you know, why have a single golden spike, you know, to represent the Anthropocene? And here we are simply, you know, we are bound by that particular bit of the technosphere, you know, that is the bureaucracy and the traditions that determine the geological timescale, you know, going right back to the Precambrian, where, for practical purposes, within ancient strata, one golden spike, is found practical, as a clear, unambiguous marker for, to represent the beginning of each geological time interval. So to make, if you like, the Anthropocene respectable, formal, and therefore bureaucratically real, as well as real, within its own terms, we simply have to follow that. We're bound by that. We have, in fact, 12 candidates sites all around the world. Some in lakes, some in estuaries, one in ice, one in a peat bog, 2 in coral skeleton, and so on. And all of them, analyzed very carefully, by these, extraordinary groups, who've sprung up to do this work. Each tell a historical story, going back hundreds of years, right up to the present, via the contained microplastics and carbon isotopes, and all of the geological information that's contained within those archives. And if you like, for me, the important thing is that all of those 12 sites, chosen more or less at random, because we're working terribly quickly, improvising on the hoof to do that, all of them tell a story of mid-20th century change, which can be traced around the world. And in terms of supporting, if you like, the geological Anthropocene idea, they are all part of that. But one of them will have to be chosen as the one, and that is simply the rules. And in many ways, I bemoan it. I'd love to have a composite, and in fact, reaching out further beyond that. In there, we can have a slight halfway house in that there are formally things called auxiliary stratotypes. So these, are other examples of the same level in strata, and they also have some kind of formal status, though they don't have, if you like, the winner status that the one eventually chosen will have. But for my part, I will, in sympathy with your question, I will be trying to push to have, if you like, the description based on le tout ensemble, all of the sites looked at, and in fact beyond that, to build this more global picture, of the Anthropocene. And as to say, why define it at all? Well, again, Peter Haff, has a very nice analogy of, he says, we can use a word like a second. For some purposes, it needs to be absolutely exact. If you're an engineer, working on a jet engine, you have to know exactly what a second is. To the microsecond, it becomes important. But for normal talking, let's say if I say I'm nipping out to the shops for a second, that can mean half an hour, or 2 hours, on that. So words can be made more flexible. Certainly, for some purposes, it is really important to pin down, decide when the Anthropocene should start, just as a measure of time. So one can measure and compare before and after climate changes, rates of waste production of different sorts, rates of biodiversity loss, and so on. So one has a means of comparison. It's a measuring stick, that's all. But for wider discussions, of course, there is, if you like, when Bron and Nigel Clark and others, are talking about the Anthropocene, they don't all have to think, oh, am I pre-1952 or after 1952 on that? There is a continuum and a process that has to be borne in mind. So it's I'm afraid, a complicated answer, which is saying partly, yes, for some reasons, it would be really good to decide, and have a consistent basis for, if you like, scientific and wider measurements, wider, if you like, how the political drivers feed into the Earth system outcomes on that. But for others, of course, yes, one should say, it's not a door, it's not a gate, it's not a barrier. It's simply part of a framework, and we have to bear that in mind, if you like, in these wider discussions, on that.
Yeah, I think Jérôme mentioned the exhibition that I was organised with Bronislaw in 2014, and Jan came to the opening, and that was called Anthropocene Monument. And it was this sort of idea that I came up with, realising that often near these golden spikes, DSSPs, structural types that Jan talked about, is erected a kind of formal monument, quite often quite traditional, with a little plaque explaining that this is the GSSP to the bottom of the Cambrian, and it was, agreed by this committee on this date, etc. And maybe a little representation at the top of the typical fossil that shows the appearance of which shows the boundary in deep time. And so I proposed to Bruno that we did this exhibition where we asked artists to devise monuments for the Anthropocene. And then after that, I published an article called Anthropocene Monument, when I kind of, and in writing that, I realised that actually geology itself is kind of monumental. So what I realised that GSSPs are doing, these golden spikes, is something which is very familiar to cultural historians, which is how, the human society always seems to operate through different registers of time. This human communicative time, the time of memory, it's usually conceived as a sort of a band of about 4 generations, to your great grandparents if you're lucky, moving through time, and generations dropping out and new generations coming in. That's communicative time. Then there's kind of cultural time, historical time. We talk about things passing into history in English, and in the past, it was often the time of the gods and the time of heroes, so certain, empirical individual who pass into the time of heroes and become celebrated in mythology into timeless time. You can see geology is, the discovery of this new, like Cuvier and others, discovery of this new inhuman time, which is the time of the earth, and then the social historical time is seen as somehow different from that. But always there is this pattern of distinguishing time and then relating them together. In the past, in oral societies, these inhuman and human times are related together through song and ritual and things like that, and then in times of nations and empires, we get these edifices, and there's usually a single one. We have one Nelson's column, which is probably celebrating a victory over the French, I can't quite remember, in London. But you've got to have one Nelson's column. You've got to have one this and one that, but also as you approach the monument, it has this enduring timelessness made of stone usually, the old monuments, aren't they? And there's a certain kind of reverence that you feel, and your human body is pulled into a certain relationship because of the spatial and temporal relations involved. But they often connect time and space in complicated ways, and it's exactly what these sections do in a way. That they, I think, that they're deep time is going down, but it's also they're relating this point to the rest of the globe as a typical example, and so on. And so, anyway, in the paper, you can see it, the Anthropocene Monument paper, if anyone's interested. I do end up arguing, rather like you, that maybe the Anthropocene needs to remain unsettled in a way, that it needs a new kind of counter-monumental aesthetic, that's more in sympathy with the sort of late 20th century revolt against the monumental, particularly after the Holocaust, the move towards more dispersed counter-monuments, which you stumble in the street rather than that you have to go and venerate. And I still think it's great that they're going to try and choose one, and it's very good to think with. I think this having a single golden spike. But yeah, I do have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Thank you, Ron. So this is the concluding words. We should replace the Anthropocene by the Anthropocenes with the S. And so thanks again, and thank you for coming, everyone.
We're going to hang up.
Okay. Okay, right. See you all.
Thank you very much. See you very soon.
See you.
Yes, it was great to be in Paris in spirit. Okay. See you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes.